The night was silent except for the hum of engines cutting through the Pacific darkness. It was August 1943, off the coast of New Guinea. The sea was flat, the moon veiled by thick clouds. Out of that darkness, three small silhouettes glided across the water. U.S. Navy PT boats. Each vessel, barely 80 feet long and built from plywood, carried men who knew they were outmatched by what hunted them. Ahead, radar blips showed the approach of Japanese destroyers. Steel giants armed with heavy guns and searchlights strong enough to burn through the night. But these American crews had something else. Speed, stealth, and torpedoes primed for a perfect strike. Engines throttled down. The sea went still. Fingers hovered over firing switches. Within seconds, 40,000 pounds of explosive steel tore across the waves toward the enemy. An ambush no destroyer saw coming. The U.S. Navy's patrol torpedo boats, better known as PT boats, were born out of desperation and experimentation. When America entered the war in 1941, the Pacific was already a Japanese stronghold. Battleships and cruisers dominated the seas, but they were too large, too slow, and too costly to patrol the countless islands scattered across the theater. The Navy needed something fast, cheap, and deadly, something that could strike hard and vanish before the enemy could react. That answer came in the form of the PT boat, built primarily from mahogany wood and powered by three Packard V-12 engines. These boats could reach speeds of more than 40 knots. They carried a small crew, usually 12 to 14 men, and were armed with torpedoes, 50-caliber machine guns, and depth charges. Their thin hulls offered almost no protection, but their agility and firepower turned them into the Navy's hit-and-run specialists. By 1942, PT squadrons had spread across the Pacific. They operated from primitive bases built on coral reefs, jungle-covered islands, or makeshift docks constructed from bamboo and scrap. Their mission was simple: ambush enemy convoys, intercept supply ships, and harass larger Japanese vessels under the cover of night. In the early days, the Japanese Navy didn't take them seriously. To the Imperial fleet, these wooden boats were an annoyance. Mosquitoes, buzzing in the dark. But those mosquitoes soon began drawing blood. One of the earliest demonstrations came during the Guadalcanal campaign in late 1942. American PT boats patrolled the slot, the narrow channel that separated the Solomon Islands. Japanese destroyers, nicknamed the Tokyo Express, used this route to deliver troops and supplies to their garrisons. Every night, they raced through under darkness, confident in their speed and firepower. The PT boats waited in silence. Operating in pairs or trios, they drifted near shorelines, using moonlight and radar to locate their targets. The moment an enemy ship appeared, they accelerated to top speed, launched torpedoes, and retreated into the shadows. Sometimes, the entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. Though many torpedoes missed, plagued by early mechanical flaws, the psychological effect was immediate. Japanese commanders began altering routes, turning off lights, and increasing patrols. They realized the Americans had introduced a new kind of warfare, one driven by agility and unpredictability. But it wasn't just tactics that defined these boats. It was the men who operated them. Most PT crews were young, many barely in their 20s. They lived hard, fought harder, and faced the ocean's wrath daily. Their missions demanded precision, nerve, and absolute coordination. A single mistake meant death. By 1943, these small boats had already begun to shape how the Navy approached island warfare. Their operations gathered intelligence, rescued downed pilots, and disrupted Japanese supply lines far behind enemy defenses. Still, what lay ahead in the waters of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands would push these men and their wooden vessels to their limits. The Japanese destroyers, fast and heavily armed, were beginning to adjust. But the Americans were preparing for something they hadn't yet seen: a large-scale ambush that would redefine how small boats could fight a superior fleet. By mid-1943, the Pacific War had entered a brutal rhythm. The Japanese still controlled a vast ocean empire, stretching from the Philippines to New Guinea. Their destroyers, sleek and powerful, moved nightly through narrow waters, supplying garrisons, evacuating troops, and transporting ammunition. These runs were known by the Allies as the Tokyo Express. Each voyage came under increasing threat from U.S. air patrols by day and PT boats by night. The PT squadrons stationed in New Guinea, the Solomons, and later the Philippines, became a constant shadow on those routes. Their bases were crude, wooden docks built from palm trunks, fuel stored in 50-gallon drums, supplies stacked under camouflage netting. Mechanics worked barefoot in mud, patching hulls and refitting engines that had burned through another night of high-speed chases. Every mission started at sunset and ended at dawn, with crews surviving on little more than coffee and adrenaline. Each PT boat carried 4 torpedoes mounted in tubes along the sides. Their engines roared loud enough to wake half the jungle, so stealth was achieved through timing and environment, waiting for storms, moonless nights, or the confusion of battle. Radar, still new and unreliable on small craft, became their silent ally. Operators learned to read the faint arcs and blips that meant death was near, or that opportunity had arrived. The Japanese destroyers, meanwhile, traveled in tight formations, relying on their size, armor, and heavy guns. Each carried several hundred men and was equipped with searchlights, radar, and the deadly 5-inch Type 3 naval guns. Against such monsters, a PT boat seemed fragile, almost suicidal. But in naval warfare, surprise could outweigh mass. In July 1943, American intelligence intercepted reports of Japanese convoys preparing to reinforce their bases around New Guinea. The U.S. Navy decided to strike not with cruisers or submarines, but with PT boats. It was a calculated risk. The idea overwhelmed the Japanese with simultaneous ambushes across multiple straits, using speed and coordination instead of brute force. Dozens of boats were deployed along likely routes, spaced miles apart, but linked by radio. Each was tasked with patrolling a specific sector. If radar picked up movement, they would engage in coordinated attacks from multiple directions, forcing the destroyers to turn broadside, their most vulnerable angle. The operation was built on 2 critical lessons learned over the previous year. First, that darkness was the PT boat's greatest ally. And second, that precision timing mattered more than raw firepower. The crews trained relentlessly, rehearsing formation maneuvers and rapid torpedo launches. The new Mark 13 torpedoes were tested, engines tuned, and crews briefed to expect heavy resistance. Most of these sailors knew they were heading into waters dominated by ships 10 times their size. As the ambush plan solidified, one area stood out as the most dangerous: Vitus Harbor, near New Guinea's northern coast. Intelligence suggested multiple Japanese destroyers would be passing through in early August, transporting men and supplies to Wewak. The PT squadrons stationed there prepared for what would become one of the most daring nighttime naval ambushes of the Pacific War. In the humid air of the jungle base, crews checked torpedoes one last time. Cigarettes glowed faintly in the dark as mechanics tightened bolts and loaded ammunition. The engines rumbled alive, shaking the dock. The night was approaching, and the ambush was set. Angle 1. Human. The men who crewed the PT boats weren't traditional sailors. Most were volunteers, often barely out of high school. They came from farms, cities, and small towns across America, drawn by the promise of adventure and the challenge of command. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of larger naval vessels, PT boats ran on trust and teamwork. Everyone did everything. The skipper might man the guns, and the engineer might steer during combat. Life aboard was brutal. There were no bunks, no showers, and no shade from the Pacific sun. The wooden hulls absorbed heat by day and shuddered under salt spray by night. Each man carried the constant awareness that a single shell could split the boat in half. Yet morale remained high. They called themselves the Boys with the Mosquito Fleet, proud of their reputation for speed, improvisation, and reckless courage. Their missions were so dangerous that many didn't expect to survive the tour. Still, they went out every night, driven by duty and by the quiet thrill of hunting a larger enemy. Angle 2. Tactical. PT tactics evolved quickly. Early missions had been chaotic. Boats attacking without coordination, firing torpedoes from poor angles, and often retreating under heavy fire. By 1943, however, the Navy had refined a system. The boats operated in small groups known as sections, usually 3 vessels working in unison. They used radar to track targets, communicated with coded signals, and positioned themselves along choke points, narrow straits or coastal routes where Japanese ships were forced to pass. The plan was simple, but lethal. One section acted as bait, making noise to draw the enemy's attention. The other 2 stayed silent, engines idling. When destroyers turned their searchlights or fired at the decoy, the hidden boats accelerated to attack range, usually within 1,000 yards, and fired torpedoes in rapid succession. They didn't linger. Within seconds, they turned hard and vanished into the black water, leaving chaos behind. This coordination gave the illusion of a massive fleet. Japanese lookouts often reported being surrounded by dozens of enemy craft, when in reality there were only a handful. The confusion was deliberate and effective. Angle 3. Technological. The PT boat was a marvel of wartime engineering. Despite being made of layered mahogany, it could outmaneuver anything on the water under 5,000 tons. Its Packard engines produced 4,500 total horsepower, enough to push it past 45 knots. Crews modified them endlessly, adding extra machine guns, improvised rocket launchers, and even aircraft cannons salvaged from downed planes. But the real weapon was the torpedo. The early Mark VIII models were unreliable, often running too deep or failing to detonate. Later versions, especially the Mark III and 15, corrected those flaws. Fitted with contact detonators, they could cripple a destroyer with a single hit. A well-placed salvo of 4 could turn a 2,000-ton ship into burning scrap within minutes. The combination of speed, stealth, and explosive power made the PT boat one of the most cost-effective naval weapons in history. Each cost around $40,000 to build, less than the price of a single Japanese naval gun. Angle 4. Enemy perspective. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, the PT boats were an irritant at first. Their destroyer captains called them small fry and dismissed them as nuisances. But after several night ambushes resulted in damaged or sunk vessels, the attitude changed. Japanese officers began issuing standing orders to open fire at any fast-moving silhouette, no matter how small. The destroyers even adjusted their convoy schedules, avoiding narrow passages and moonlit routes. Crews installed extra lookouts and mounted additional light weapons to counter surprise attacks. But this only increased stress. Many sailors reported sleepless nights, knowing that unseen enemies might be stalking just beyond radar range. In captured diaries recovered after the war, Japanese sailors described the experience vividly. They came like shadows, small, quick, impossible to hit. By the time the lights found them, torpedoes were already in the water. For the Japanese Navy, the PT boats were proof that America's strength lay not in numbers, but in innovation. The next stage of the story would show exactly how that innovation changed the balance in one unforgettable night on the waters of New Guinea. Angle 5. Leadership and Command. The PT boat program attracted bold leaders who thrived on independence. Officers were given more autonomy than almost any other branch in the Navy. Commanders like Lieutenant John Bulkley, Lieutenant Thomas Warfield, and a young Lieutenant John F. Kennedy became living symbols of this free-spirited warfare. They weren't polished strategists, but they understood risk and intuition. Kennedy's command of PT-109 showed the balance between danger and ingenuity. He learned quickly that survival depended on reading the sea, anticipating the enemy, and trusting his crew completely. Many PT leaders came from small colleges or merchant fleets, but they shared a common mindset: move fast, strike hard, and adapt instantly. Their unorthodox thinking often clashed with traditional admirals, yet results spoke louder than rank. One admiral famously remarked that PT boats were the cavalry of the sea, swift, unpredictable, and impossible to control from headquarters. That independence was both their strength and their burden. Angle 6. Psychological Impact. Night after night, the PT men operated in near-total darkness. The constant roar of engines, the smell of fuel, and the fear of sudden gunfire wore them down. The human mind wasn't built for such tension. Sleep was rare, food was cold, and silence meant danger. Some crews coped with humor, others with silence. Many grew jumpy, reacting to every shadow or splash. Yet despite exhaustion, they remained proud. They called their craft fragile killers, aware that bravery was their only armor. Reports from the Pacific show high morale even in prolonged missions. Letters home spoke not of fear, but of belonging, a brotherhood forged in salt water and adrenaline. Psychologists later noted that PT veterans showed stronger unit cohesion than almost any other naval group. They fought as individuals, but survived as one mind. Angle 7. Strategic Value. PT boats were never designed to win battles on their own. Their real power lay in disruption. They forced the Japanese Navy to waste time, fuel, and ammunition on constant defense. A convoy that once moved freely at night now needed escorts, lights, and layered formations. Every ambush slowed Japan's supply chain. Destroyers that should have supported frontline operations were instead assigned to PT patrol duty. In the Solomon Islands alone, over 200 Japanese vessels were either sunk, damaged, or diverted because of PT activity. The cost to Japan's logistics was massive, and the psychological drain was even greater. Their presence changed enemy behavior, proof that a handful of small, cheap boats could alter a vast naval strategy. Angle 8. Legacy of Innovation. The lessons from PT boats didn't end with the war. Their design philosophy, speed, stealth, and modular firepower inspired generations of naval craft. The Navy's modern fast attack boats and littoral combat ships carry direct traces of PT DNA. Even today, naval special operations rely on similar principles: surprise, precision, and agility over armor. The legacy extended beyond machines. The PT program changed leadership thinking. Commanders learned that small units with flexible command structures could outperform rigid hierarchies in unpredictable environments. The PT mindset became a foundation for later special warfare units, including the Navy SEALs. What began as an experiment in desperation evolved into a model of modern naval warfare. The PT boats had earned their place in history, but their most legendary moment was still ahead. The night they faced Japanese destroyers in an ambush that would define their legend. It was late 1943. The waters near the Solomon Islands glowed faintly under a pale moon. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of fuel clung to every breath. Somewhere to the north, radar stations picked up a faint movement. Japanese destroyers cutting through the night, heading toward supply routes around Vela Gulf. The Americans had been waiting for a moment like this. 12 PT boats, hidden near the island's shadow, prepared for one of the most daring ambushes of the Pacific War. Engines hummed quietly, throttled low to avoid detection. Crews whispered final checks. Each man knew what was at stake: A destroyer carried firepower that could erase a PT boat in seconds. Lieutenant Commander Robert Briscoe gave the signal. Engines to attack speed. The calm night broke into motion. PT-156, PT-157, and PT-159 moved out first, their wakes slicing through the dark like ghostly streaks. Behind them, others followed in staggered formation. They were not charging blindly. They had studied the route, the moonlight, and the timing of the enemy's movements. Through binoculars, a lookout spotted the first silhouette, long, low, and fast. A Japanese destroyer, then another. 3 in total, moving in a column formation. The lead ship was likely a Fubuki-class destroyer, armed with torpedoes, anti-aircraft guns, and radar. Against them, the PT boats carried lighter torpedoes and machine guns, but held one advantage: surprise. The first wave adjusted their angle to attack. The command passed down the line. Torpedoes ready. Crewmen steadied their aim, hands tense on the release triggers. The sea felt silent, waiting. Then, one after another, streaks of white foam burst forward. The torpedoes were away. Seconds turned to eternity. The boats swung hard to port, engines roaring at full throttle. The destroyers reacted too late. One explosion tore through the darkness, followed by a second shock wave that sent a column of water skyward. The lead Japanese ship shuddered violently. Fire bloomed across its midsection. The ambush had worked, but the battle wasn't over. The remaining destroyers opened fire, their guns lighting the night like brief flashes of daylight. Tracers ripped across the waves. PT-163 took near hits that peppered the deck with shrapnel. PT-157 weaved erratically, engines screaming as shells splashed meters away. The sea turned into chaos, white water, smoke, and flashes of red light. One American torpedo malfunctioned, turning in the water, forcing a desperate maneuver to avoid disaster. Another PT boat, PT-164, caught a glancing hit that damaged its steering, yet still managed to launch its final torpedo before limping out of range. The Japanese destroyers tried to regroup, their searchlights cutting through the dark, but every flash exposed them to new angles of attack. The PTs moved like sharks, quick strikes, then vanishing into the blackness. Within minutes, the ambush became a series of coordinated assaults from all directions. A third explosion erupted as another torpedo found its mark. A second Japanese destroyer rolled heavily, its stern lifting from the sea before sinking slowly beneath the surface. Survivors scrambled on deck, their silhouettes framed against the burning sky. Over radio static, American crews shouted confirmations. "Hit amidships! Second ship sinking!" The voices were strained, elated, terrified. It was the kind of moment that seared itself into memory. By the time dawn began to break, the water was littered with debris. The surviving Japanese ship retreated toward the open sea, its guns silent, its formation shattered. The Americans had lost no boats, though several were badly damaged. The 40K ambush, as it later became known, proved that the smallest vessels could cripple giants when precision met courage. It was a new kind of warfare, where darkness and speed mattered more than size and armor. And though the sea fell quiet once more, the victory carried a cost. The men had seen what it took to bring down giants. The smoke from the ambush still hung low over the sea. The faint glow of burning oil drifted across the waves, painting the horizon in dull orange light. For the crews of the PT boats, victory had no celebration, only exhaustion, ringing ears, and the sharp smell of fuel and cordite. Lieutenant John Bulkley, monitoring reports from nearby bases, understood what the battle meant. The Japanese Navy had long considered their destroyers untouchable at night. They relied on superior optics, speed, and discipline. Yet here, in the narrow waters of the Pacific, Those same destroyers had been outmaneuvered by wooden boats, costing a fraction of their value. Survivors from the Japanese ships later described confusion and disbelief. They had been ambushed in near-perfect silence. Radar gave no warning. Torpedoes appeared without sound. To them, it seemed impossible that small craft could deliver such precise devastation. That disbelief spread across Japan's naval command, forcing a re-evaluation of their defensive tactics in the Solomon Islands. For the Americans, the success validated years of experimentation. The Navy had taken a gamble on the PT concept, fast boats carrying limited armament, run by young crews and untested leaders. Critics had dismissed them as suicide craft. Now, those same skeptics had to reckon with hard proof. The PT boats could strike deep, escape alive, and break enemy confidence. Radio dispatches carried news of the ambush to Allied bases across the Pacific. Headlines in military bulletins described "Small boats, big kill." The story traveled quickly, boosting morale among sailors and Marines fighting in nearby campaigns. To many, the PT fleet became a symbol of innovation, a sign that ingenuity could offset numerical disadvantage. But behind the heroism was brutal fatigue. The men of the PT squadrons had been running continuous missions for weeks. Fuel lines leaked, engines overheated, and ammunition ran low. Every patrol risked mechanical failure in enemy waters. During the ambush, several torpedoes had misfired, a reminder that even victory depended on luck and instinct as much as design. When the boats finally returned to base, their hulls were riddled with bullet holes. Mechanics worked through the night, patching damage with scrap metal and welding plates. The smell of oil mixed with sea salt as crews refueled and rearmed. No one spoke much. The men simply knew another night like this could come at any time. In debriefings, officers noted how the Japanese destroyers never fired effectively once the first torpedoes hit. Panic had spread through their ranks. The destroyers' formation broke down, their gunners firing blind into the dark. The Americans, meanwhile, had coordinated with near-perfect timing. Each torpedo attack followed a carefully planned route, with boats covering one another's escape paths. It was textbook ambush execution, something few had believed possible at sea. The Navy's official report of the battle highlighted 3 key lessons: the power of mobility, the importance of surprise, and the need for independent command decisions. PT commanders were encouraged to act on instinct, using their deep knowledge of local waters. That flexibility became a model for future operations across the Pacific, from the Philippines to the Bismarck Sea. Yet the night's victory carried a quieter legacy. For the men aboard, it was a reminder of fragility. They had seen the ocean swallow giants, but they also knew that one lucky shell could erase their boat in seconds. Every mission after that night carried both pride and dread. They were hunters and prey in equal measure. By early morning, the wreckage of Japanese ships drifted silently toward the horizon. Birds circled above the oily water. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, swallowed the remains of the battle. For those who fought it, the ambush became more than a tactical triumph. It was proof that courage, when combined with precision and discipline, could rewrite the rules of warfare. And though the men returned as heroes, the war was far from over. The Japanese Navy would adapt, and the PT squadrons would soon face their hardest test yet: survival in an ocean where victory often came at the cost of everything else. The dawn after the ambush revealed the scale of what the Americans had achieved. Oil slicks stretched for miles, littered with shattered planks, floating debris, and fragments of uniforms. The sea that had been alive with gunfire hours earlier was now eerily calm. The sun rose slowly over the Solomon Islands, exposing a silent graveyard of steel. Navy reconnaissance confirmed that 2 Japanese destroyers had been sunk outright, with a third heavily damaged. Dozens of Japanese sailors were lost at sea, while survivors clung to wreckage until captured by patrols later that morning. For Japan's Imperial Navy, it was a humiliation. These were not massive fleet engagements, but surgical strikes from vessels so small and cheap they were almost dismissed as irrelevant. The United States Navy quickly documented the success. Reports were sent to Admiral Halsey's command, detailing how coordinated torpedo fire, radar spotting, and flexible maneuvering had turned an apparent mismatch into victory. Engineers studied every technical detail: engine temperatures, torpedo angles, even fuel consumption rates, to refine future ambush tactics. Word spread fast through Allied bases. Crews who had doubted the PT concept now asked to join the squadrons. Shipbuilders ramped up production, improving hull designs and fuel efficiency. By 1944, nearly 200 PT boats were operating in the Pacific, and many carried lessons learned from that night. For the Japanese, the psychological damage was immense. Destroyer captains began altering their routes, hugging coastlines or delaying movement until daylight, both actions that made them easier targets for aircraft. A small unit of fast boats had changed enemy behavior across an entire ocean. But for the men who fought that night, triumph came with scars. Many returned to base running on fumes, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. They cleaned blood from decks, replaced damaged engines, and patched bullet holes with sheet metal. The sight of empty bunks reminded them that victory always came with loss. Commanders noted a new tone in their reports. The crews had matured. They no longer saw themselves as daredevils, but as specialists in a deadly craft. Every mission carried weight. Every night could be their last. The exhilaration of the ambush faded into a sober understanding of the war's cost. Still, the success reshaped naval thinking. High Command now recognized that agility and surprise could outweigh brute force. In the months that followed, PT boats began operating deeper into Japanese-controlled waters, striking at convoys, supply barges, and transport ships. Their growing legend inspired a wave of innovation that would influence naval doctrine for decades. The Pacific War was shifting, and the lessons of the 40K ambush were spreading far beyond those who witnessed it. But the story didn't end there. The aftermath of victory would test the endurance of the men who lived it, as new missions pushed them to the edge of survival. Weeks after the ambush, the PT squadrons returned to operations with renewed purpose. Their victory had made headlines across Allied command posts, but the men understood how quickly the ocean erased triumphs. The Japanese Navy adapted fast. Destroyers began sailing with increased escorts, their radar teams now on constant alert. The element of surprise, once the PT's greatest weapon, was slowly fading. The Americans responded by evolving again. Intelligence officers began mapping enemy supply routes more precisely, relying on coast watchers and aerial reconnaissance. PT boats started coordinating with submarines and aircraft, forming hybrid ambush teams that struck by night and vanished by dawn. The lessons from the 40K ambush became a playbook for unconventional warfare. At Tulagi and Rendova bases, mechanics worked tirelessly to reinforce hulls and upgrade torpedo systems. Some PTs were fitted with radar for the first time, giving their crews an edge in detection and navigation. The technology was crude, but in the dark Pacific nights, even a few seconds of early warning could decide life or death. The men, however, bore the heavier cost. Fatigue was constant. Missions stretched for 12 to 16 hours, often without food or rest. Mosquitoes, heat, and exhaustion gnawed at morale. Some sailors broke down from the pressure. Others buried the fear behind silence. Letters from home arrived months late, water-stained and wrinkled, reminders of a world that felt impossibly distant. Yet, they kept going. The brotherhood among PT crews became their anchor. They trusted each other more than any manual or order. When engines failed or shells ripped through the hull, it was the crew, not luck, that decided who made it back. Veterans often described the sound of the twin Packard engines as the heartbeat of survival. As long as they roared, they lived. By early 1944, PT operations had expanded far beyond the Solomons. New squadrons moved into the Philippines and New Guinea, pushing closer to Japan's defensive perimeter. The tactics that once defined small-scale raids were now shaping the Navy's broader offensive strategy. The PT boats had grown from an experiment into a crucial weapon of disruption. Japanese survivors from the ambushed destroyers later testified that morale never fully recovered. They spoke of sleepless nights, fearing unseen attacks from the dark. Even when no PT boats were present, destroyer crews fired into the waves at imaginary threats. The mental toll lasted long after the physical battles ended. For the United States Navy, the ambush marked a turning point. It validated the power of speed, intelligence, and precision in modern warfare. It proved that innovation could topple tradition, and it showed that the smallest units, when guided by courage and coordination, could change the outcome of entire campaigns. The war was far from over, but the legend of the PT boats had already been written, etched into the waves of the Pacific as proof that no weapon was too small and no enemy too large when the sea itself became the battlefield. The Pacific still remembers the wake of those wooden boats. Long after the war ended, veterans of the PT squadrons would recall the sound of the engines, the smell of burning oil, and the flicker of tracer fire against the horizon. To them, the war wasn't about grand fleets or admirals. It was about the quiet courage of small crews who dared to fight giants. The ambush near Vela Gulf became more than a naval engagement. It symbolized a shift in warfare itself. The United States had learned that mobility, precision, and innovation could overcome brute force. The PT boats proved that technology mattered less than adaptability, and size meant little when paired with strategy and willpower. For Japan, the ambush exposed a truth they had long ignored. Their dominance at sea was no longer absolute. It showed how quickly an empire built on tradition could be shaken by speed, surprise, and resourcefulness. Many of the men who fought that night never saw their actions as heroic. They called it survival. But history remembers them differently. Their small victories, multiplied across hundreds of missions, eroded Japan's reach and confidence. Each ambush, each raid, each silent departure into the night helped tilt the balance of the Pacific. The wooden PT boats rotted away long ago, but their legacy shaped modern naval warfare. Every fast attack craft, every special operations unit, carries a trace of their design and spirit. What began as an experiment in desperation became a lesson in courage, a reminder that in war, ingenuity can outshine power, and the will to fight can turn even the smallest vessel into a symbol of unstoppable force.